Thank you so much for the introduction, Maya. And I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon or whatever time of day it is for you, and start by saying a thank you to the team of people at Apex that has helped to make this project possible. It's been such a joy to work with you developing the exhibition over the last few months and the last few days in person. I also want to thank the artists who are included in the exhibition for their support, for having the opportunity to share space with them. I've been truly humbled and energized by this whole process. And I'll just echo what Maya said about how innovative and interesting the open call process is. So for anybody in the audience who might have an idea, might not have thought of themselves as a curator, but wants to give it a go, has some compelling commentary on society, I would definitely invite everyone to submit an application and see what happens. It's truly been a fantastic process and a joy to work with you all. So Maya's given a bit of an introduction to the overall exhibition concept. I want to start with giving a little bit more of that background context, and then we will walk together through the various artworks that are in the show. So I want to start a little bit with the contemporary political moment and inspiration for thinking about the oceans. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of underwater fiber optic cables that connect the internet. And as succinctly stated in the work of Tabita Rezaire, whose single channel film appears in the show, the internet does not exist in the clouds. It exists on the ocean floor. And so I've been thinking a lot about different theorists, novelists, historians, artists who help us to think about what it means to approach the ocean floor. So the exhibition really moves with the historical routes and movements of different ships, small vessels that refugees have fled on, major trading and warring vessels from the 18th through the 20th and 21st centuries. We're thinking about the kinds of shards of history that can be found on the ocean floor, whether through the fiber optic cables, through the small pieces of porcelain, through the ecological and geological processes that help us to index forms of climate change. And bringing all of these pieces together, I've taken inspiration from the poet and writer Dion Brand, who's originally from Trinidad and Tobago. And the name for the exhibition, A Thousand Secrets, takes its title from a passage in her book, A Map to the Door of No Return. So Brand writes, "The sea sounded like 1,000 secrets, all whispered at the same time. In the daytime, it was indistinguishable to me from air. It seemed to me to be made of the same substance which carried voices or smell, music or emotion." And throughout the exhibition, I've really tried to create a multisensory experience. There are places where we can hear sea shanties, there are olfactory installations, there's sense of hope, there's a sense of naming processes of structural and historical violence, all of these together. And what was really sort of intriguing to me was the question of how thinking with the ocean as backdrop, as materiality, helps us to really think about the histories and the stories that are submerged, what it means to linger in the opaque, and how we might hold all of these different connections between people, places, processes together to build and imagine alternative futures. And so the exhibition asks, what modes of world making come into focus when critical oceanic studies bridge the poetic and the geopolitical, wrestling with the possibilities of radical humanism forged through and below the waterline? what histories of imperial extraction, racial colonial violence, and relationality come into focus as we listen across the storied waters of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean littorals. The answers to these questions, the thousand secrets, are held in the wakes and waves, in the movements and multitudes of ocean-going vessels, in the creative depth of the sea itself, and in moments of ecological and infrastructural duress that stretch through and below the waterline. And all of these together create and present urgent lessons for how we listen to the past, present, and future of planetary crisis. And so the exhibition itself is meant to be a kind of journey. There are multiple possible routes through the gallery space, each of which might generate a different series of questions and synergies. Likewise, the artworks create a multisensory experience invoking sound, touch, smell, and sight, which is meant to unmoor conventional understandings of world history and chart alternative itineraries for relational world making. So now Ryan will turn over to the virtual curatorial walkthrough. And we will begin at the front of the gallery space with a collection of documents related to the history of sea shanties. So in this corner, we can see a collection of archival materials, anthologies, sheet music, and songbooks, each of which are dealing with the history of sea shanties, which is one of the most popularized forms of folk knowledge about the ocean. Through the lyrics, we can explore the intricacies of everyday life. We can see connections between different sectors of labor. For example, one of the texts discusses how runaway sailors were often hired as sheep shearers in South America and Australia. So sea shanties actually were widely taken up on farms and grazing pastures across different industries. And at the same time, sailors were often galvanized by the heroic outlaw tales of figures such as Jesse James. And so what's interesting about these lyrics is that often they bring into critical question, like, where does the sea end and begin? Which tales, ideas belong to seafarers versus other kinds of dock workers, agricultural workers? And at the same time, as we can see with the Red News Chronicle book that was published in London in the 1860s as a way to build community amongst ordinary people, and in response to the idea that singing in the home had become less popular. And so it's interesting that community building was achieved largely through introducing sea shanties back into the home, as well as plantation songs, Negro spirituals. And so there's a lot that we can learn about particular moments in history by understanding the connections, how folks in power saw the connections between sea shanties and other kinds of ballads, folk songs. And yeah, through all of these, I'll invite you to take a listen, and we can, they teach us a lot about the politics of sexuality, the understandings of empire, the various routes of trade from the 18th through the 20th century. And the next artist that we will discuss is Debra Jack. Jack is a multimedia artist who is currently based between New Jersey and St. Martin in the Caribbean. Jack's work engages a variety of strategies for mining sites of cultural memory, exploring the effects of colonialism, and negotiating a global present. Her single-channel video installation here engages the dualities of erosion and embrace from the coastal regions of the Caribbean Sea. The full title of the work is Drawn by Water, Sea Drawing in 3 Acts. This is the 3rd act, and the subtitle reads, Sinking, remember that the embrace of oceans is the love I know, and yearned for a familiar shore, that ellipsis. And so there's a kind of openness to the question of yearning, longing, unfolding, liminality within the text or within the piece itself. And we can see this tension between embrace, erosion, love, and longing. And so contrasting the idyllic scenes of leisure that most often shape popular imaginaries of the Caribbean region, Drawn by Water invokes a feeling of melancholy, uncertainty, and tension. The dynamic motion of the tides and shifting sea form are set against the droning frequency of the raspy whistle, which is a phenomenon that occurs when a large westward propagating wave interacts with the seafloor. The bottom pressure causes a whistle-like sound in A flat, and any variance can be used to predict and measure coastal flooding and changes to the Gulf Stream. The sounding of the ocean floor invites us to consider the various markers of ecological crises and the complex interplay between the erosion of memory and ecology in the Caribbean basin, as well as the wider geopolitical and geological reverberations. I will pause now so that we can experience a bit of this, and I'll tell you more about Jack's work. All right, yeah. And so I'll invite you to watch the full piece on the Apex website and say a bit more about Debra Jack's work. So as I previously mentioned, this is the third installation in Jack's Drawn by Water series. Overall, the Drawn by Water project explores the fluidity of water as it interacts with the shore and the lines that are created by this encounter, as well as the temporary quality of those lines. The piece gestures towards the more subtle manifestations of erosion and destruction, and much of Jack's work draws upon the parallels and connections between the violence of the Middle Passage and natural disasters that currently impact the Caribbean region. In a recent interview about Jack's retrospective at Pen and Brush, the artist explained that hurricanes travel along similar routes and use similar winds and natural currents that the slave ships used to travel. For the artist, the hurricane was the natural way of dealing with loss, with trauma, and with these bodies being carted across the ocean and perishing at sea. While Jack's work attempts to reckon with the spectacular violence of the Middle Passage, the artist refuses to reproduce the spectacle of suffering. Instead, Drawn by Water presents generative openings for engaging the multiple registers, frequencies, and manifestations of loss, longing, and radical lifeways. The next artist in the exhibition is Tuan Andrew Nguyen. And so we will start with the hand carvings and then go back to the still. So Tuan Andrew Nguyen's practice explores strategies of political resistance enacted through counter-memory and post-memory. Extracting and reworking narratives via history and supernaturalisms is an essential part of Nguyen's video works and sculptures, where fact and fiction are both held accountable. Set in an unspecified future, Nguyen's single-channel video, The Boat People, follows a group of children led by a strong, resourceful little girl who travel the seas and collect stories of the world they never knew through objects that have survived through time. In the exhibition, we've included 3 such objects that feature from the film project. The first is called Not the Sword That Killed Magellan. This is a replica of the Kampilan, a traditional Filipino blade that's on view at the Mount Samat Museum. The sword was widely used by warriors and chieftains in battle and for head hunting. According to Filipino history, it was the Kampilan that the legendary hero Lapu-Lapu used to slay the Spanish conquistador and explorer Ferdinand Magellan, who is credited with the first circumnavigation of the globe. The second piece is a plaque that is a replica that commemorates the treacherous journey of 9 men and 3 women who fled Vietnam by boat in 1981. Vietnamese boat people is the name given to the some 700,000 refugees who fled Vietnam by boat or ship after the Vietnam War. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimated that between 200,000 and 400,000 boat people died at sea. Other estimates compiled put that number to the fatalities number closer to 700,000. The third hand-carved sculpture, they're all made of Malina wood, which is indigenous to Southeast Asia and Australia. This one is called Not the Smell of Napalm. It is a replica of foliage found in the jungle of Bataan by the beach, suggestive of a fossil. The carved leaves embody the perseverance contained in the memory of the land itself. Napalm was used extensively by the United States against the entrenched Japanese forces in the Philippines during World War II, and became a central weapon of the US military during the Vietnam War. Reports state that roughly 388,000 tons of American napalm bombs were dropped in the region between 1963 and 1973. In addition, the devastating effects on human targets and civilian bystanders alike, napalm bombs could create firestorms that burned through acres of jungle in a matter of seconds, leaving a defoliated landscape in the wake. And so together I see the 3 found object hand-carved statues as shedding light on the multiple rounds of maritime, militarized, and imperial conquest that have all shaped the history of the islands of the Philippines and its interrelations with Vietnam, the region of the Pacific, and more broadly, the context of Japanese and later American imperial pursuits. They help us to think about how these multiple rounds and routes have impacted each other, how they're layered, and at the same time, what kinds of questions about history we can ask from this kind of more obtuse, oblique examination of object studies, the kinds of histories that they hold. And then the final piece from Nguyen's series is a still from the Boat People film, and it's called The Last Woman on Earth. The little girl, who we discover is the last woman on Earth, comes face to face with a mysterious Kuan Yin statue buried in the sand on the beach in Bataan. They engage in a dialogue that explores concepts of a future and a past world through an existential lens. This dialogue, both literally and figuratively, brings the dead object back to life again. The Kuan Yin, or female Buddha of compassion, is regarded as one of the most widely beloved Buddhist divinities. with powers to aid all who pray to her. She is generally seen as a source of unconditional love, and more importantly, as a savior, also known as the goddess of mercy. And so I see this dialogue again as a way of interrogating how future generations and younger generations can learn from the past, but also thinking about the possibilities of building alternative worlds and futures based on the ethos of compassion, mercy, relationality, ways that we can shift away from these processes of destruction. And the emphasis on spirituality within Nguyen's work is also something that we'll see later in the work of Tabita Rezaire, who engages African and Indigenous spiritualities. And we will now turn to the work of Trevor Paglin. Thank you, Ryan. So Trevor Paglin, pause for some water. Trevor Paglin is known for investigating the invisible through the visible, with a wide-reaching approach that spans image-making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and numerous other disciplines. Paglen's NSA tapped cable series similarly plummets to the ocean floor. Paglen's photographic series unearths visible traces of government surveillance at telecommunications choke points off the coasts of the Bahamas, Colombia, and Florida. In a 2016 article in Wired, Paglin explained that once you start, quote, once you start looking into the infrastructure, it becomes obvious very quickly that 99% of the world's information goes through little tubes under the ocean. Those are very juicy targets for somebody who wants to surveil the world. The series includes photographs taken during more than 30 dives alongside collage displays of Edward Snowden's leaked NSA documents. Building on the exhibition's theme of listening through and underwater, Paglen's series demands an attentiveness to the underwater infrastructures of state secrets and to technologies through which the nation state listens to us. And so the first piece in the series was taken off the coast of the Bahamas. The second piece on the far wall is at an unspecified location in the Atlantic, on the ocean floor. And the third piece is off of the coast of Colombia. So while we were doing the install for this exhibition, I had learned from some of the folks at Apex that Paglen has also done has previously done multiple shows at Apex Art. And I had a chance to look through some of those catalogs. So Paglen appeared at a 2014 exhibition called Private Matters that was curated by Siren Edam, Jamie Schwartz, and Lisa Hayes Williams that revisited the political context of art against the backdrop of global networks and technological innovation, and included Paglen's earlier work on predator drones and military black sites. As the curatorial statement for that show reads, "Secrets are revealed, security measures of institutions are tested, and myths, both personal and collective, are interrogated." The demands to denaturalize media infrastructure remain prescient within our political moment, and we can understand the Underwater Cable series as adding new dimension to the broader interrogation of geography and aesthetics of the American security state. The next artist that we will discuss is Renee Green. And for this one, I'm going to pause so we can watch the clip before I begin my introductory remarks.
The mind is bombarded by a veritable barrage of dreams that seem to burst upon it like waves. Billions of images surge up each night, then dissolve almost immediately, enveloping the earth in a blanket of lost dreams. Absolutely everything has been imagined during one night or another, by one mind or another, and then forgotten. Louis Buñuel.
Thank you. So again, I'll invite you to watch the full 74 minutes of this single channel video on the Apex Art website. So this is an excerpt from Renee Green's single channel video essay entitled Endless Dreams and Water in Between, which was initially commissioned by the National Maritime Museum in London in 2009. So Green is an artist, filmmaker, and writer, via films, essays, and writings, installations, digital media, architecture, sound-related work, film series, and events. Her work engages with investigations into circuits of relation and exchange over time, the gaps and shifts in what survives public and private memories, as well as what has been imagined and invented. So Endless Dreams and Water in Between further grapples with the challenges of unfolding relations across islands. Situated across Manhattan, Yerba Buena, and the islands off the coast of San Francisco and Mallorca, the video's characters build intimacies through an experimental letter exchange, the goal of which is not utopia, but a momentary nexus and embrace of time's expanse. The video is a meditation on various dreamscapes, temporalities, geopolitical and geological processes, and literary traditions that mediate oceanic histories and offer praxis of relation and intentionality against the turbulent and fractured world. Here, the sea and the long histories offer a kind of balance, both real and imagined, to contemporary war machines, digitization, and the increased precarity and flexibilization of labor and social life. In a 2009 article first published in the French language arts periodical Multitudes, Green explained that the stimulus for this project was the desire to move through the water of many others, generations before her, and underscores that Endless Dreams is about the ceaseless desires and attempts to fulfill these. No matter how futile these attempts may be, the diverse impetus leading to the traversal of water and what is or isn't found. The motif of the wave figures centrally throughout the film. Dreams burst upon like waves, as in the short clip that we watched, and as the characters watch waves crash, they reflect upon the distances that the waters have traveled. The act of travel itself is repeatedly called into question as the artist critiques mythologies of islands as deserted, devoid of life, and the idealized search for something new or better, all of which have variously informed the movements of missionaries, explorers, and others who have named and made a claim to the islands from which the women characters are writing. In contrast, the letter writing experiment and creative practice proposed by these characters refuses the pretense to utopia. It is not a utopian community, but rather a momentary nexus that embraces the present, however, is also calibrated in relation to time with a consciousness of time's expanse. And the latter is a direct quote from the piece. In the context of the exhibition, the archipelagic archipelagic mind of endless streams and water between offers a subtle yet evocative call to question what is new and how history resides in the present, and to put these critical histories to use as we experiment with alternative modes of intimacy, desire, and imagination through and across oceanic futures. As popular discourse grapples with what it means to shift priorities and recalibrate space-time amidst the reeling destruction of the global pandemic, Endless Dreams offers a powerful blueprint for conscious engagements with the history of the places we inhabit, curious orientations to the theories of space and time, and commitment to an ethos of intentional experimentation. The next artist whose work we will discuss is Beatrice Glow. Glow is an artist leveraging interactive media installations and multi-sensory experiences in the service of public history and just futures. Glow's multi-sensory installation probes histories of Dutch colonial extraction and indigenous knowledge systems in the Banda Islands of Indonesia. The exhibition presents parts of her larger Rune Hatton, A Tale of Two Islands projects, which explores imbricated histories, afterlives, and indigenous knowledge ways that developed in the aftermath of the 1667 Dutch decision to trade the island of Manhattan for the English colony of Rune, one of Indonesia's nutmeg-rich Banda Spice Islands. Since 2016, Glow has been working with Bandanese and Lenape cultural bearers to amplify transnational perspectives on the ramification of colonialism and these entangled histories. In Glow's single-channel film Obanda, Moluccan poet Rudy Fofide recounts the sorrows of the island and the memories and imagination of a new generation. The video pans over the ruins of Dutch fortresses, forested islands, and vistas of open oceans, inviting us to hold these ecologies and infrastructures in tense relation. We'll pause now and watch a minute or so of that video.
Oh, Banda. Banda, oh. Duka Banda adalah duka pala. Luka Neira, luka Ai, Run, luka Lontor, Nailaka. Letusan Gunung Alifur, letusan Fuli Merah, lahar biru. Duka Banda adalah duka rakyat jelata, duka sempe-sempe. Ketika berkah rampa-rampa jadi kutuk, orang-orang kaya dimiskinkan demi kemuliaan Nassau dan Belgika. Duka Banda adalah retak tempurung, pala mandul, cengke mati, gadis, dan hongi dengan 1000 kora-kora adalah suangki satu benua. Tidak punya haru, hanya santet. Tidak punya malu, hanya sihir.
Great. So the rest of the film is online on the website. But there you get a sense of the kind of sorrow, the language of sorcery, witchcraft, all of which are meant to convey the violence and destruction of Dutch colonialism on the islands. And the film is accentuated with an olfactory installation called Spice is Gold. 2 cylindrical vases are filled with terracotta clay-formed nutmegs infused with fragrance and shards of broken porcelain that depict key moments in the history of the Banda Islands that are drawn from indigenous oral traditions and extensive archival research. And if you have a chance to visit apex directly, I invite you to pull your mask down briefly and smell the nutmegs. It's actually quite a strong smell. And yeah, and it's great to get up close so that you can see the intricacy of the hand paintings on the porcelain pieces. So in Glow's artist statement, she explains that she borrows the transporting power of smell to retain evaporating memory and fight erasure. And so the olfactory smell-based pieces have been a consistent part of Glow's practice over the last several years. And she has stretched some of that work to think about tobacco trade as well as nutmeg. And so in a conversation with the curator, me, Glow explained that the shards are inspired by porcelain pieces that she found washed ashore while researching in the Banda Islands. Merchants regularly tossed broken porcelain overboard before docking in colonial ports in order to evade customs and taxes. The shards can be found on the ocean floor and regularly wash up on beaches from Malaysia to St. Croix and the Caribbean. In the latter, locals call the fragments chani, a play on China and money, and children use it as play money. And so very interesting thinking of all of these pieces together. Historians, and I think to some extent artists, we often think about shards or fragments of history as a sort of analytic or analogy for how we do historical investigations, historical research. But I think Glow's piece really helps us to think about the literal and material dimensions of these fragments, to understand that when we plummet to the ocean floor as a space of inquiry, we're confronted with the more contemporary fiber optic cables, which we can see routed over the same paths as slave ships, as hurricane routes, but we can also find these smaller traces of storytelling, of erasure, of evasion, avoidance, state violence, that can help us piece together these various narratives about world history, the challenges of studying and understanding global racial capitalism, trade, all of these different entangled and embedded processes through an oceanic orientation. And the final artist that we will discuss is Tabita Rezaire. And I think I will show you the two brief clips from this before we go into the discussion.
Oh, actually, I'm not good. Yes, it's this internet thing, this Facebook thing, yes, you know. No, my friend, it's like I've posted something about the white people saying that they should give our land back, you know. Yes. And they've banned me from Facebook. Can you believe it? Dumb or idiot or something like that. I don't know. This is racism on a serious note. This is really not good. It's like they are not treating us equally. They are not treating us like human beings. Oh my friend, you know this data thing, they really need to follow, you know. Yes, because we are wasting our money buying data instead of buying cold drink and a dress or a bread or something like that, you know.
Electronic colonialism is the domination and control of digital technologies by the West to maintain and expand their hegemonic power over the rest of the world. Salvador warned us in 1995 when he wrote, "The West desperately needs new places to conquer. When they do not actually exist, they must be created. Enter cyberspace." Electronic colonialism is one of the many ways in which colonial domination survived after its defeat. While settler colonialism was the policy and practice
Great. So this piece is called Deep Down Title, and it is 2017 work by artist Tabita Rezaire. As we can see, it's a net art style that excavates the communicative properties and interfaces of the world's oceans, where some of the other artists have focused on the ocean as a sort of backdrop where information, telecommunications, technology is held. Rezaire's work really pushes us to think about the water itself as holding, transforming, mediating data, knowledge, stories. Throughout the piece, she talks about how water holds trauma, water is trauma. And so even though it begins with this question of the fiber optic cable, she's really thinking through different spiritual traditions from Southern Africa, as well as South America, about the ways that water itself is data, holds data, to really help us to think about modes of connectivity between different places, but I think as an interesting way to draw connections between the different artworks that are in the exhibition. So Rezaire has roots in French Guiana on the northern coast of South America, and developed this project while living in Johannesburg. Her artwork blends various fields of knowledge, cultures, and views into a web full of references to mysticism, science, ecology, African history, and post-internet cultures. I think we get a sense of all of that from the short clip that we watched. Rezaire's focus is on contemporary manifestations of electric colonialism, enacted through submarine fiber optic cables, and considers how the cables are layered onto colonial shipping routes, as well as the Middle Passage, all of which mediate quotidian practices of daily life, such as the phone calls we make to our friends, the networks of data that allow us to get onto Facebook and other social media, the places that we listen to music, whether on Spotify or another music platform. So grounded in knowledge systems of the African diaspora, the artist's rich toolkit of speculative fiction, spiritual traditions, and situated histories offer urgent lessons for the planetary future. As modern information and communication technologies become omnipresent in our industrialized reality, we urgently need to understand the cultural, political, and environmental forces that have shaped them. Likewise, like countless African and indigenous traditional sciences, research in physics now suggests that water has the ability to memorize and copy information, disseminating it through streams. What data is our world's water holding? What messages are we encoding into our waters? Beyond historical sorrow, water is a portal to other realities, as it is mysterious sea life of mermaids, water deities, serpent spirits, and celebrated that are all celebrated in many cosmologies reminds us. So I'm going to briefly form some connections that I'm seeing between the different works in the show, leaving a lot of it open-ended and, as I said, kind of a journey that's meant to provoke different kinds of synergies and connections. So Rezaire's piece adds historical depth to Paglen's photographic investigation of undersea cable networks. Where Debra Jack's work has mapped the overlapping routes of historical slave ships and modern hurricanes, Rezaire's piece shows how transatlantic fiber optic cables follow similar routes. Each of the pieces in the exhibition offers the distinct window into the secret histories of a particular region, whether it's the ocean downloading secrets or the various histories of obscured, obtuse explorations of violence, relationality, and so on. At the same time, the aesthetic and analytical tools offered by each artist generates new lines of trans-regional and global inquiry. To what extent do the Pacific Ocean fiber optic cables uncovered by Edward Snowden and photographed by Trevor Paglin map, literally and figuratively, onto the imperial and militarized routes within Tuan Andrew Nguyen's work? What political possibilities arise from the problem space of thinking across the Atlantic and Pacific worlds? Of the multisensory explorations of nutmeg and napalm, and the search for shards of history in the oceanic depths from Banda to Bataan to the Bahamas to Yerba Buena and back again. The exhibition does not offer answers to these questions. Instead, it offers multiple modes of journeying, diving, wading through the difficult histories that help us to understand the injustices of our present and build more just futures. Thank you again for staying with me through this, and I look forward to all the questions. I'll leave it there.
On screen share. Thank you so much, Mae. That was amazing. Thank you for that really rigorous and deep exploration of those works. It's such a beautiful show, and I really love just the lines that you've drawn between these works, starting with the title of 1,000 Secrets and thinking about, so many, not only the hidden depth of the ocean, how much we really don't know about what actually is contained there, but also the sort of impossibility of accessing narratives across, through the colonization of the world, and so many of the lost stories and lost experiences, and bringing these artists together to kind of work through not only stories that we can kind of access with these different objects, but also mythologies, old mythologies, new mythologies, future ones, and sort of the interplay between all of those things. It's really comes together so beautifully. And I just want to thank you for bringing this beautiful show to our space at Apex Art. There's a question here from Elizabeth specifically about Debra Jack's video and the gorgeous audio. And the question is, if that's a musical interpretation of the Rossby whistle, or if it's actually a direct recording.
So I believe that it's a mix of both. I know that the Rossby whistle actually omits an exact A flat sound. And so I know that parts of it are the whistle itself, and then there's also some dubbing and some playing with frequencies that the artist has also done to accentuate it. So I think it's a combination.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Please, I encourage people to drop some more questions. I'll get us started off a little bit, and you've given us so much. I'm sure we don't, I feel like there's the things I want to ask you, and I'm like, but she already really went into that. So, but I am a little curious just about the process for you. A couple of things. I know that it's such a specific investigation, and I know your own research, this is really in line with the research that you do in your own work. So my first question is sort of like, what brought you to come to the world of maritime experience? What brought you to the ocean? What guided you to the ocean as an area of exploration and work and theory and investigation and curation?
Sure. So that's a very long question. I'm going to give the shortest version of that. So as you know, but I believe most of the people on the call won't know, I recently finished a PhD dissertation that was looking at the role of African and Asian descendant seafarers in building anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-imperial political organizing in the period of the 1920s and 40s. And when I got to grad school, my plan was to study contemporary Black Lives Matter organizing and movements against police militarization, state violence. So in my first semester, I actually took a history course. So I was trying to understand the different dimensions of transnational organizing for racial justice through time. I settled on this period of the 1920s to 40s, really, for the purposes of a seminar paper. And then I kept coming across these references vaguely to networks of radical sailors that were distributing all of these Pan-African, communist, Black nationalist, Indian nationalist newspapers and periodicals all over the world. They were hiding them in their sailors' trunks. They were sewing the pamphlets into Bibles, anything that they could do to get them around colonial officials and customs officials. And I realized that nobody had written about these people, really, or there were a few texts, but there was certainly a lot more to understand about who some of these individuals were, how they were politicized, where they're doing all of this kind of work. And so as I was writing the dissertation, though, I realized that, in many ways, the book format, and especially the academic nonfiction, it's quite linear. There's an argument, there's the methods chapter, and I kind of just kept coming across this idea of, I couldn't quite index or get at all of the complexities of oceanic storytelling in that format. And so I started looking to the work of different artists that were thinking about relationality in these different kind of more oblique, open-ended ways as a way of sort of working through the impasse of how to represent the archive. Right. And I think my process is very iterative in the sense of, I can see very clearly how, Renee Green's work interprets how I read the archive, right. Rather than just saying, oh, here's a social science methodology, here's art curation, and really kind of iterative back and forth between them. And, you'll notice that there actually isn't very much of a discussion of maritime labor in the show, outside of the sea shanties. And I think that was a very conscious decision in many ways to focus on forms of world making, life making, speculative fiction, hope, and all of these things, because I also think that the movements that I write about in my dissertation, yes, these are workers and there's a particular subject position labor within that, but then there's always all of this excess complexity, relationality that I'm always trying to figure out, how to talk about, because we don't always get those insights into ordinary people's lives.
For sure. And these movements don't come out of nowhere. They're a context. They rise from, a specific context and time. And I sort of laughed when you were saying what you went in to study, because it's so different. I mean, but it's not at all. And I think that that's the thing that's so meaningful, is the through line here,
Right.
Sorry, I'm just coughing.
Yeah, and kind of thinking about the through line, like I was able to find these examples of, different industrial shipping crews that are traveling through these different ports across the Atlantic, and they're doing like study groups, and they're pledging to to raise consciousness and awareness about, the Scottsboro boys, who are 9 African-American boys wrongly accused of raping a white woman in 1930s Alabama. So there is this consciousness raising, there's this commitment to teaching each other, to telling others about racial justice, lynching, the limits of the criminal justice system, Jim Crow, kind of making these connections between the horrific practices on rubber plantations throughout Southern and Central Africa. And like really, in some ways, the questions, and the issues are the same. It's just thinking about like, where and how does transnational solidarity come into being?
Yeah, there was, I believe it was in the piece at the back. Wait, I don't have the artist's name right in front of me. Would you say the artist's name at the very back?
Rezaire.
Yeah, Rezaire. Rezaire's work, I believe it's in that one where they show the roots, because you use the words like charting and roots as a word, but the roots of like the slave ships that came across the world, across the Atlantic, are the same exact roots now that the lines are the digital that spread the internet, that bring the internet around. They're the same trajectories. And so thinking about those early sailors that you were looking at, or I guess it was in early 20th century, so it's not the earliest sailors, but they were spreading the message along, having access to global communities. They're sewing these pamphlets into Bibles and putting them on. So it's like, in a way, the people who were able to travel on the ships were the ones that were kind of bringing these global diasporas and communities and people all around the world who are subjects of colonial, what's the word I'm looking for? Governments, or whatever it is you want to say, they were the ones. Today we have the internet, but those same routes were traveled by these sailors. So I think there's an interesting kind of metaphor there.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that some of the folks on the call would have seen the recent articles in the New York Times about the Haitian Revolution and all the new connections, or recently in the news connections that people are making about the histories of French banking. And really, it was sailors who circulated a lot of the information about the uprisings that are happening during the Haitian Revolution in 1804. And some of those were sailors who had deserted from the Royal Navy, white sailors, Irish sailors, who faced repressive working conditions on ships. Some were free or fugitive people of color who were working on the docks. Sometimes they're on, fishing vessels, working up and down the coast. Sometimes they're hired on to British ships, which is really interesting. There are quite a few free, formerly enslaved Africans that worked on transatlantic some slave ships, some other kinds of trade shipping. But this idea that we have this long-standing history of transatlantic communication, word of mouth, spreading rumors, news. And we can see in the archives that plantation owners were so confused consistently about how the slaves on their plantations got this information. And it's like,
right.
Whoa, somebody told somebody in the market, and the lady that you let go to the market heard about this. And so they, were able to join this larger revolt. And we can see those connections across the Caribbean islands, up through the southern states, even as far as New York and Massachusetts.
Yeah. And back to just, we'll wrap up in a moment, but just thinking about like this exact thing, the secrets of the ocean, and the oceans being much harder to privatize than the land. And so in that sense, it becomes, I don't want to say commons, because even outside of human resource, human, action or kind of grabbing of the space, but it's like, it is like the global commons is this ocean space. And so in that way, it allows for more free movement of association, free movement of sort of shapes of things can come together that might not be able to happen on land where things are a little bit more controlled. So that wonderful kind of like liminality of the ocean. And I think that this show really brings that forward in such a beautiful way. So thank you for this extended conversation. It's been such a joy working with you and learning about your area of research and all of the works in the show. I wanted to ask you a bit about how you came to these artists, but I think you spoke a little bit about sort of how the interplay of finding the artists actually inspiring you to maybe bring some of your research into a new form, which is a really interesting way to approach curation.